So welcome. My name is Rich Clybourne. I'm the executive director of the Gundalow Company, and I would like to welcome you to the first of three presentations in our inaugural speaker series that we're calling the World Oceans Experience. These presentations feature people and organizations that are engaged with the ocean environment, whether it's traveling in or on it, whether it's working to conserve it, or bringing it to us into our homes through photographs and videos. And the cool thing is that they all have ties to the Seacoast, New Hampshire area. We desperately wanted to do this in person, but Omicron caused us to switch to a virtual format. And we're hoping that we can do this next year in person, be live in one of the local venues in Portsmouth. So please stay tuned. I have to say that you all have set a record for attendance for all of our virtual gatherings that we started back when COVID hit in 2020. We had 215, I believe it was, people register for this presentation. And right now we are up to 132 actual participants. So those two numbers far exceeded anything that we had in the last 2 years for our virtual gatherings. So thank you for joining us. And to all of you who saw fit to make a donation, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. The dollars that you donate go to support and strengthen our education programs. And I'm thrilled to report to you that as of today, we have 57 school programs scheduled for the spring, which maxes out just about, we have 2 or 3 slots open. That's a number that we thought we weren't going to get back to for several years. So even though we're coming out of COVID, it seems like the schools are willing to have their folks or their kids come in and take a trip on the Gundalow. So thank you very much for that. So now to the real stars of the evening. I don't believe that Molly and Jeff need an introduction, but just in case you don't know who they are, I just want to let you know that they have lived in the Seacoast area, specifically in Portsmouth, for a long time. Molly is the founding director and director emeritus of the Gundalow Company. And Jeff is a retired history professor from University of New Hampshire. And he's written several books, all of which are good. I recommend that you pick them up and read them. And the thing about them, though, is they both have a passion for sailing. And that's what you're going to see tonight. So let them take us, or let them take us with them on their trip from New Hampshire to New Zealand. Take it away, Molly and Jeff.
Okay, well,
all right.
Thanks,
you,
Rich. Thank you, and welcome everyone. My heart is pounding to think of you all there. It's a thrill to think that you're along with us for this evening, and we're going to share. So anyway, thanks for being here tonight. We're going to share some of the highlights from this trip, and we'll be emphasizing the places that are the most remote and hard to reach. As you may know, we spent about 34 years planning this trip and thinking about it. Then the last year was really the solid preparation time. But finally, on November 18th, 2018, we sailed down the Piscataqua River. And, I think at that very moment, we were full of excitement, obviously, but we also had the faith in each other and the faith in our boat. And just a shout out to Kittery Point Yacht Yard. They were with us every step of the way as we were getting ready to go. And we couldn't have done it without their help and support. So we appreciate that constantly. We also, why isn't it moving here?
No, screen's frozen.
Screen's frozen here.
So let's not do that one again.
There we go. So this was the day we left as we were sailing out. Thank you, Matt, for bringing everybody out on the Piscataqua. That was an emotional moment, to say the least, and we really appreciated the grand send-off that you gave us. And thanks also to Bob Cosman, who took some great photographs, including this one as we were sailing away past Wood Island. It was a glorious morning. It was chilly, but still a glorious morning. And we had a plan, actually pretty clearly defined that morning. We'd been saying to ourselves all along that if we once we got to Gloucester, we said let's go to Gloucester, and if we're still having fun after Gloucester, we'll keep going. And it turns out we had a great time in Gloucester, and the next day we carried on and kept going to Newport And then by Thanksgiving, we were in Mystic Seaport. It was 19 degrees Thanksgiving morning, a bit too chilly for comfort. Ice formed all along the hull. And it was dreadful. And the day we left Kittery, there were 2 inches of snow on the deck. So we were not in the warm weather yet. And honestly, it just kept getting colder. By the time we got to New York, still cold. And it was actually really cold all the way to Morehead City, North Carolina. We went down the intercoastal waterway, cold, cold, cold.
So from Morehead City, just south of Cape Hatteras, we jumped off across the Gulf Stream, as we've done a number of times before. And blessed be, within 24 to 48 hours, we're shedding our woolies. It's the short pants latitudes. Finally, this is what we had wanted. So we sailed nonstop to the Virgin Islands. It was Christmas at sea. We had a lovely Christmas together. 12-day passage. We have done it on this boat, the 2 of us, in as short as 8 days. So it was a long passage, mostly uneventful. I mean, you know, that's qualified. One afternoon, we had a cold front approaching and the staysail furler jammed. And then we went to start the engine overheated, needed a new impeller. So something we had 3 things to deal with. That's ocean biz. You just roll with the punches. By the time we got to the Virgins, we began really what would become our routine for the next year, an offshore passage, followed by island hopping or local exploration, followed by another offshore passage. This meant when not at sea, anchored in a place like this, we had swimming every morning, a luxury for those of us from chilly New Hampshire. Mo and I love the Caribbean. I've been sailing in and out of those islands for 45 years on different boats. In the last 10 years on our boat, the 2 of us have been in and out of the islands. We took the boat to the Caribbean 4 times before setting out on this longer trip. And we love it there. We could have stayed. We could have stayed easily for a long time. But we had been planning something more ambitious and we felt we were ready. So here at the Saints, little islands off Guadeloupe, we dropped the mooring one day and we bore away towards Panama. That would be new territory for both of us. Light at first, here we are, wing and wing, full mainsail, full Genoa. Genoa's poled out. The boat is going downwind in gentle conditions. And we've got dolphins around saying goodbye, sort of fun to be with the dolphins. Of course, ocean biz doesn't always stay as gentle. Now we're down in that area north of Colombia, notoriously boisterous. Mainsail's long since in. Genoa's reefed down a little bit. We're carrying on. We still had a little too much sail for all. We're going 7 to 8 knots, surfing down some seas at 10 knots and stressing our steering. But here you can see we don't really steer. Look, Mon, no hands. It's not me steering. It's this monitored wind vane behind me, that thing flopping around. It's a mechanical device, not electronic, that steers the boat. It's like having a 3rd crew member, but without the aggravation.
It's a quiet 3rd crew member, not very demanding. So it took us about 9 days to get from Guadeloupe across the Caribbean to the San Blas Islands, which are just this side of Panama. And we had made plans ahead of time to meet up with our friends, Janicki and Graham. They were there a week or so ahead of us, and we had a great catch up with them and basically did some, socializing and swimming there. And we did go ashore to a number of the little San Blas Islands. They're really like just piles of sand. What you see behind those houses is actually the mainland. And there are all these little bitty islands stuck out in the middle with, a very, very traditional society. They dress the way those women are shown dressed there. They actually do dress that way. They live in these grass houses, but the irony, the contrast, if you look closely, you can see there's a solar panel sticking out of the roof of each end of those houses because they needed to charge their cell phones, and they didn't have indoor plumbing, but they had their cell phones. So it was kind of an interesting contrast. And because the islands themselves are just sand, they have to go to the mainland to do all their gardening. They have extensive gardens that reach up into the mountains. They actually eat very well, but they have to work hard to get their veggies. And they use these dugout canoes. So we saw these dugout canoes everywhere, and they were they were quite graceful to watch as they went by full of people and coming back from the mainland full of their farming efforts. But it's a sobering place for sure. They do these molas. You might have seen these beautiful reverse applique fabric art, I guess you'd call it. And they're mostly made by the women, but it's the men who do all the selling, the peddling. So they would come out to the boat with their boat loaded up with these molas. And we bought several every time they showed up. It's like, you can't say no. And we certainly didn't want to insult them. So we came home with quite a few molas.
You skip one.
And we spent then from the San Blas, it's just maybe 50, 60 miles to get to a marina that's just this side of the Panama Canal, which is where everybody waits and gets organized to go through the canal, which is kind of a big ordeal, as you explained.
So Panama's marvel is the canal, the shortcut to the Pacific. We were instructed by our pilot, who you can see here in the red shirt, to heave up the anchor from that anchorage on the Caribbean side of the canal. We had 3 friends aboard as line handlers. That's a requirement because once you get into the locks, the water swirls around, the boats tend to surge. There are professional line handlers up on the pier, and we have line handlers on the boat. This is jumping around. So the the chef on board, that was Molly, a vegetarian chef, served dinner that night to all hands. Well, the Panama pilot saw the bowl of stew coming his way and he said, "I love stew, but I hate vegetables. What is the meat?" And Molly finessed this by glugging lots of hot sauce on it and pretending not to understand him, but he came back for seconds. So we went through the lock, rafted up to some yachts behind this big Nord Mississippi ship. Close to midnight, we got into the Lake Gatun where we stayed for the night. Our pilot left. We got a new pilot, this black man, in the morning, who would carry us on towards the Miraflores and Pedro Miguel locks. These are some of the Panama Canal locks. Here's a line handler from him. It's just another day at work. And
that line connected to us down, he's holding us, tied to the side there.
And for me and Molly, it's actually a heaving one. For me and Molly, it's like the adventure of a lifetime. So we descended to the Pacific in the rather close quarters of this car carrier. We got to the bottom. We're anchored there off Panama City, Balboa, and we're looking at each other and looking out at the widest ocean in the world and saying, "Are we going to do this?" Take a deep breath. We're going to do it. So it's only 1,000 miles to the Galapagos, and we shoved off, heading for the Galapagos. And it was initially, we're getting close to the equator. We're at 7 degrees north outside the Gulf of Panama, and it's clammy and almost chilly. We realized it's the Humboldt Current coming up the coast of South America, bringing a lot of cold water, pushing us to the north. But as you can see, we picked up some hitchhikers along the way.
And pretty soon there were 8 of them, all crowded around, sitting on the bow pulpit, sort of jostling for position.
And shitting with gusto.
Shitting all over the boat. They were making a huge mess.
So they're cheeky. And as I went up to scare them away, I thought first with a boat hook and then with a bucket of water. They just glared at me like, "Who are you, pal?" And the closer I got, the sharper those bills looked. Anyway, we were lucky on that passage not to have too much of the doldrums. This is a notorious area for doldrums, no wind. We had a fair breeze, gentle breeze, but a fair breeze for everything except about the last 75 miles of a 1,000-mile trip. So we turned on the engine for the home stretch there into the islands. Now I want you to look here up in the upper left corner of your screen. What we have is the latitude 0000.1 south. We had just crossed the equator, and this shows here our boat heading for San Cristobal, where we anchored the next day. When the sun came up and morning was in full, we motored through the largest number of sea turtles we had ever seen. There were sea turtles everywhere. It's a marine protected area. It turns out if you don't kill creatures, they have more babies. So we dropped the anchor in Wreck Bay, San Cristobal, looked at each other, high fives. We were a little giddy, like we're in the freaking Galapagos. So we had a glass of wine, celebratory, and went to bed.
And then, we were eager to get into tourist mode, but before we could do that, we had to go through the whole customs rigmarole, which included 10 officials who climbed on board our boat, sat around the cockpit. There was a policeman with a gun. There was a Coast Guard guy wearing these big dark glasses, but no smile. A guy with a ponytail who's the national park official. And then there was a young woman doctor, and then an immigration officer, and then there was an agricultural inspector. There was an entomologist who had this little vacuum cleaner, and she went around down below sucking up the air, trying to find little airborne bugs. She didn't find any. And then there was this one little guy, maybe in his late teens, his job was to carry everybody's clipboard. So it was quite a scene. We're all jammed in the cockpit, hoping that we're going to get through this process so we could go ashore. They did take away our chia seeds and our frozen raspberries, big concern about invasive species. So they took those. And then it looked like we were good to go. We were all set. The very last step we had to do was to take down the quarantine flag, which you're required to fly when you get somewhere. And then, great solemn moment, you're meant to raise the courtesy flag of the country you're entering. So the flag's halfway up, Jeff's standing there raising this flag, and everybody in the cockpit started speaking Spanish really fast, and they looked upset and angry, and we didn't know what they were saying. And it turned out, much to our chagrin, that even though we had carefully purchased all the flags in advance of all the countries we were going to be visiting, it turns out that by mistake, we were sent the Colombia flag, not the Ecuador flag, and the Galapagos are part of Ecuador, and there we were putting up the Colombia flag. And it was a bit of a moment. We all kind of gasped and we were embarrassed, but we got through it, luckily, and then we could shift into tourist mode. We were greeted by sea lions everywhere. Everyone had warned us ahead of time, don't put your dinghy in the water, because if you do, you'll come back and it'll be full of sea lions, which was true. They would just climb right in and kind of settle in and then look at you like, what are you doing? This is my dinghy. You can't have this boat. And they were everywhere. And they were fun to watch. They were a little smelly. They were a little cranky, but they were definitely part of the scene. We visited 5 islands in the Galapagos group. There's very strict rules about the things that you can and can't do. So we were actually only allowed to go to some of them on our own boat. And then there were others where we had to go with a guide and a group, which we were happy to do. And we learned a lot. We saw everything you'd imagine you'd see, including all the land tortoises.
Some things we didn't imagine.
Well, yeah, I don't know that we'd imagine.
Short-eared Galapagos owl.
Oh, and we saw an owl. Yeah, that was fun. Lots of the little finches everywhere, Darwin's finches, but we never could figure out which was which. But it was definitely this otherworldly landscape. And the trees, my God, the trees looked like they were right out of a Dr. Seuss book. And there were, just this, it was this very eerie kind of landscape. And, there were a lot of people actually we met later who said they had skipped the Galapagos because there is all this bureaucracy and it's kind of a big deal to get in, but we're really glad we stopped. So we were allowed 30 days. So we stayed for all 30 of them. We had, I guess, the one little birthday party.
The morale officer, who was also the mate, made sure the mate, who's also the morale officer, made
I had
sure
other titles
not to skip the skipper's birthday. So here we are, anchored off Santa Cruz, having a bit of a birthday celebration.
And then when we left the Galapagos, we knew that was going to be the longest offshore leg of the entire trip. It was just over 3,000 miles. We had done a lot to get ready for this, and we were there's no land in between the Galapagos and Marquesas, so it's not like you can stop anywhere. So we carried on this big empty stretch of ocean, and it began this rhythm of, because we were heading west, every night, actually this is in the morning, the sun was rising up behind us, and then every evening the sun would set ahead of us. And we got into this rhythm of, the whole feeling that we were going along these miles where other great navigators had gone before us, Captain Cook, Joshua Slocum, and Irving and Exie Johnson on the schooner Yankee, all these others that we've been reading about for decades. And it was really magical. And I think too, we started to pick up on this recurring theme, which was the teamwork for the two of us, the self-reliance on ourselves and each other, and realizing that we were out there on our own. And the weather really dominated every moment. And we were just marveling at the daily sky shows. A scene like this, I took a lot of pictures of clouds because, you can be out there in the middle, and every once in a while I'd say to Jeff, we might be the only people in the world right now that can see these clouds,
For
so
sure.
yeah, so it was really amazing. And the stars, the colors of the water, the moon, I mean, the whole thing. And whatever we were doing, we always stopped to watch the sunset. We were grateful constantly, and we were also really mindful about being present. It was all about today and each other.
So it's mostly an empty ocean. We didn't see any boats. We saw one vessel between the Galapagos and the Marquesas, over 3,000 miles. That was 80 miles west of the Galapagos. But it's not entirely empty in other ways. I would do a deck walk every morning, not getting my exercise, more like a deck check, but often picking up the kamikaze flying fish and the squid that would come aboard. The flying fish, we were struck at how small they were compared to the ones in the Caribbean, where we often collect flying fish in the morning and eat them. But here, the flying fish and the squid were pretty small. One evening, the ocean wasn't so empty. We had the best dolphin show of the trip. 30 dolphins or so suddenly came up towards the bow, riding the bow waves, squeaking, leaping out of the water entirely. And we're shouting, get some air, brother. Meanwhile, ahead, the sunset, the sky is turning tangerine. We're having our cup of tea, and we said, well, this is actually pretty cool. Back in the Galapagos, a friend had, I guess, texted or put up an Instagram post or something saying that, a friend from New Hampshire, saying that she thought we were insane for doing this. I said, yep, a little insane. We live like savages, often naked. We're generally unwashed. We're eating things that we caught and killed with our own hands. We didn't see any other people for weeks at a time. We existed at the sufferance of the weather, and of course at the sufferance of all the systems that make boats like this work. They make electricity, they flush the toilet, they set the sails, etc. What's the gear? What's going to break? And then mundane tasks, of course, such as getting dressed when we bothered, or washing dishes, or making coffee, or whatever, could be pretty challenging depending on how the boat was moving around. But compensations abounded. The night sky is truly exquisite, like nothing ashore, and there's the majesty of the sea in its moods, whether it's being driven by the trade winds perpetually or a deep swell coming in from the Southern Ocean from some gale far away. There's also these extraordinary places that we went. Island scenery is in a category of its own. So finally, it was really the deep satisfaction from pulling this off. Not totally insane.
And here, this was our first big land ho after 21 days. That's the Marquesas up ahead. Hiva Oa came into view as the sun came up. We had just watched the moon go down ahead of us. The wind died down, even though we've been going along at a good clip, but it suddenly everything slowed down into slow motion. And we just made this very somber approach. And although we never turned on the engine because there is some pride in going every inch of a 3,038 mile sail. And this passage had been magical. There's no other way to describe it. And I guess, for a brief moment, we considered pressing on.
For a brief moment, we considered not stopping. In other words, the passage, as Mal just said, had been magical, and we'd never spent 21 days in those conditions. It was just really, really cool. Bernard Moitessier was a famous French sailor who in 1968 was way out in front of the first single-handed round the world race. And he'd gone from Europe, under Africa, under Australia, under New Zealand, under South America. He's back now in the South Atlantic, and he's heading for home, and he's winning. And he decided to abandon the race because he didn't want to stop. And he turned around and went back under Cape Horn to the South Pacific. And we looked at each other and we said, this is our Moitessier moment. Not imagining for a minute that we had his degree of skill or commitment, but it was like just that magic. We didn't want to stop.
But there we got to Hiva Oa. We'd read before Herman Melville had described this very seen as craggy and verdant. We added the additional description. There was always this whipped cream on top. The clouds just never seemed to dissipate from that spot. And we were euphoric. I mean, the adrenaline was running, but we were also just feeling this euphoria. We're here, we did it. And we were also just really eager to get ashore, to explore, stretch our legs that felt like jelly for the first couple days, feel the earth holding still under us. And we also really were looking forward to stocking up on the pamplemousse, these grapefruit that are literally as big as bowling balls, and mangoes everywhere falling off the trees. Paul Gauguin was who introduced the Marquesas to the rest of the world. It's a group of islands within French Polynesia set off by itself. We visited several of them. Here we are after Hiva Oa. We went to windward a little ways to Fatu Hiva, which is one of the other islands. It was sort of an interesting day that you can't tell here, but it was foggy and cloudy. It sort of felt like Muscongas Bay more than the Pacific. But Fatu Hiva is this incredible spot with a very narrow, deep harbor. It's actually been described as one of the top 3 most beautiful harbors in the world. So that gave us some pause. We just sat there looking at it. It was just incredible. And then we started noticing all these little goats. They're climbing up, like straight up these rock formations without any hesitation. And then we wondered, we're going to start seeing these goats falling into the water, but they never did. Few other boats there, not too many, a little tiny village. We'd been corresponding with Bobby Sweet, and she had told us that there's this fern in the Marquesas that had been recently discovered. In parentheses, it grows at about 3,000 feet. A lot of jokes there. And so we thought, well, we'll see if we can go find it. We'll go looking for the sweet fern. Then we started talking to some of the locals, and they all looked at us like we had 3 heads, and they said, you can't go up there without technical climbing equipment, just forget about it. So sorry, Bobby, we never did find the fern, but we had a great old time in Fatu Hiva.
And then it was on to Nuka Hiva, another Marquesa, hiking through the valley of the Taipes, in which Herman Melville had spent some months with one of his shipmates. They had absconded from their whale ship, the Acushnet, in 1842, and they went native for a while. He based his novel Taipei on this episode. There we are. We're like, this is a temple ruin. I'm thinking Melville was probably right here, for Professor Jeff. That was sort of cool. We hiked later near Daniel Bay on Nuka Hiva, went into this waterfall and came back. This local couple invited us for a lunch. We were hiking with a few other yachties too. I think there were 5 of us. And we had to ask ourselves, what's it like to be invited for lunch by the descendants of cannibals? Are we being invited
not for
to lunch or for lunch? But anyway, they were lovely people. They were funny. He served a nice meal of lobster and fish, which he had caught that day. His wife had veg from her garden. But these are very poor people. Their housing would certainly be considered substandard. Their outdoor kitchen was not exactly what Western standards might consider hygienic. There's lots of flies around. It's a poor place, and they live in a tough way, but they were generous. We were happy to meet them, to hang out. And I was struck by the fact that when Melville was there in 1842, he was desperately afraid that his face would end up getting tattooed like this man's, and he would then be unable to return to what he called civilization. Mal and I debated it, but we decided to abstain. Here we are, Daniels Bay. The track goes in between the cliffs, rather dramatic.
Yeah, and as beautiful as the Marquesas were, and as awed as we were by the scenery, we did begin to pick up on the sort of somber underside. Jeff mentioned some of it, but as we learn more of the story, Europeans, when they showed up, they virtually eradicated the traditional culture. Almost all the Marquesans were dead by disease and depression, and then suicide by the early 20th century. And the more we learned, we did just sense this sort of sadness with this landscape. There weren't very many young children. There were a lot more men than women. And so there was this sort of sadness really about the place, which, I think after being there for a month, it was time to move on. And the next stop was the Society Islands, which big contrast to the Marquesas. We had a 7-day passage to get there, and we stopped, once we were there, we spent a couple months. We visited Tahiti, obviously, and Huahine and Bora Bora. Very upbeat. Everything you've ever heard about those places is true. The beautiful fabrics, the flowers, the markets, lots of early morning veg and fruit markets, fantastic people watching. I just love this woman here. And everywhere we went, the women had these big piles of flowers on their heads, and they were like, it was just gorgeous everywhere. And just no matter what they were doing, they were wearing flower crowns the way we wear baseball hats. So I had to get one just to sort of feel like a local. And it was right about now that we started to understand why so many cruisers, whether it was people we were meeting at the moment when we were there or people we'd read about in the past, there were a lot of cruisers who get as far as Tahiti, Bora Bora, and they don't get any further.
Right. So I had taken 35 years off from scuba diving back from my younger years, but I did a quick research dive in the Galapagos and did a few deeper dives there, looking at sharks and turtles and fish and all, pretty cool. But basically we had dive gear on board just if we had a mechanical problem, an anchor hanging down or whatever. Here in Huahine, in the calm lagoon, it was a perfect time to strap on the dive gear and clean Chanticleer's bottom.
Okay, and this is funny. I had to read from my journal from that day. I wrote, some days are more action-packed than others. Yesterday, we walked on the beach at dawn, took all our laundry to be done ashore, cleaned the outboard carburetor, swam around the boat for hours, scrubbing the water line, and then we watched the moonrise. This morning, we went out in the dinghy to watch all the manta rays cavorting and eating. But today's singular focus is for Jeff to go diving and scraping a few barnacles off the propeller and keel. Just another day in French Polynesia.
So when it was calm, like in the Huahine Lagoon, the mate and morale officer, who was also the chef, fed us very well. We ate lavishly. Actually, we ate very well on this cruise. We had no complaints at all in the dinner department.
And we noticed there is no postal delivery in these islands, but we started seeing all these really deep mailboxes. And it turns out this is actually true, that people have a subscription for their daily baguette. It gets delivered every morning. And so by that point, we knew we were in paradise.
So Maupiti, it's a little island here, became our last stop in the French Polynesia. It's about 25 miles west of Bora Bora. If you look right over the top of that mountain peak on your screen, you'll see two little islands out there, and the pass that gets through the reef is between those two islands. You can see all the shallow water surrounding that, okay? So Maupiti has a challenging pass. It's a tiny little slot in the reef, and there's a short window near slack tide to get through that slot. So a boat ahead of us on the VHF said, yeah, it's like class 2 rapids, but doable. So we had about 10 minutes of heart in throat as max RPMs going through the slot, waves breaking on each side of us, big rollers sweeping us in against the already outgoing tide. And we don't have any pictures. We don't have any fun. We actually, Molly is looking for the ranges and calling to me as the ranges line up. I'm steering, judging the boat with the tide. We had already battened down all the hatches, but had the drop boards in the hatch just in case, you know, something really bad happened. And then suddenly we're in the lagoon. It's peaceful, it's calm, it's very chill. So this is sort of classic running the passes in the South Pacific. We've done this before. But we later hiked to the top of the hill, a couple thousand feet high, spent a few days here, really found it charming. From Maupiti, an easy 5-day passage to Rarotonga, the Cook Islands. People always ask, what was the hardest part of your trip? Sorry, no pirates, no hurricanes, no shipwrecks. The boring answer was that the hardest part of our trip was force-fitting modern life's technology into the South Pacific reality. The broadband out there is crummy. The devices are never plugged in overnight when the tech companies upload their patches to their apps. And then humorless, self-important people in America, like insurance companies, for instance, would get their knickers in a twist about not being able to contact us. We teetered on the brink of irrelevance. Luckily, our old friend Dan Moreland, who has sailed around the world 8 times, has some good connections in the Cook Islands. Dan put us in touch with his friend Brendan at the Cook Island Maritime Registry. Brendan's a young man who graciously made available to us his modern office. And we spent a day or two keeping the tech dragons at bay because of that generosity. So here's a little bit of video for you to savor South Pacific. Day after day, just rolling along. Sometimes the motion of the boat was more extreme. Everything would start to thump and rattle in the cupboards down below. Miscellaneous bolt or shackle key would start rattling in the bosun's locker. Things that weren't nailed down would get airborne occasionally. They shouldn't have, but they did. And then it would stop, and you think, okay, it stopped, we're good. And then it would start again. So the challenge along this way is trying to get some sleep. And you'd find yourself wedging into your bunk with your pillows and stretching your arms out and putting one knee against the bulkhead, just trying to get some stability. Ultimately, it was easier to be awake sometimes than to be asleep.
Well, and you wake up feeling like you just run a half marathon.
Sometimes. All right, so here's our approach towards Palmerston Atoll. I'm getting a little height of eye here to find the anchorage off Palmerston in the Cook Islands. Anchorage is a misnomer. There is no anchorage. It's just a slightly deeper coral patch between the reef and the vertical wall dropping to the abyss. Remember, all of these coral atolls are a little fringe of islands in a ring around what was the top of a volcano. So these little bitty islands sit on the rim of this has-been volcano. The approach to those little bitty islands is very deep. It's not like the east coast of the US with a continental shelf, okay? In fact, once we got anchored, the humpback whales cruising the wall right next to us, we reach out and touch them. We've been told to wait outside the shallow pass, the small boat pass, and wait for Palmerston's officials. They're all related to each other. There's only 35 people that live on this island. None of the visitors use their own dinghies. The locals know the reef and the locals know the weather. And if the wind shifts, the atoll can quickly become a lee shore. The guys will get you into their motorboats, hustle you back out to your yacht so you can depart immediately. Everyone doesn't make it. This is a derelict there on Palmerston.
A little visual reminder.
Right.
So as Jeff said, there were 35 people living on Palmerston. They're all related to each other. They're all descended from William Marsters. He arrived in 1863 and had 3 Polynesian wives, and together they had 23 children. And so everyone who's there now is a descendant of one of those 3 mothers. And that determines where you're allowed to live on the island. So literally there would be these lines in the sand of where the neighborhoods are. And
Marsters was an English seaman with these
right.
Polynesian wives. So there's a dynamic here on the island about, whether we're Polynesian or English. Many people to this day insist that they are English, not Polynesian. So it's a complicated place.
Yeah, very complicated. So this was Eddie Marsters. We were sort of assigned to him. He adopted us and we stuck close to his side for the whole time that we were there. We ate all our meals with his family, including his elderly mother. The woman in the back there is the doctor for the island, nurse. She was from Papua New Guinea. But it was really fascinating. And the kids were delightful. They were just very gregarious, tagging along. We always had a stream of kids running along behind us, trying to be the gracious hosts and asking us all these silly questions and basically just being fun. We did get a nice tour of the school. We saw all their projects. We met the teacher, and then we were treated to their welcome to the island dance. And I have to tell you, I wanted to bring all these kids home and take them on the Gundalow. Whoops, go back there, sorry. I thought we could just bring them back and Okay, so we didn't bring them all home with us, but we were definitely enamored by what we saw there. And just as we were walking around the island, you'd come upon a little neighborhood, and each house had an outdoor kitchen and an outdoor area where there's a table and chairs, and you were meant to sit down and eat something and visit, which, I mean, that's basically what we did. We'd move from one place to the next, and we'd hear stories, lots of gossip. There's some jealousy and backstabbing going on. We had to hear all of it. Like, everybody wanted, visitors come and they all want to unload a little mini therapy session. So we heard more stories than we would have thought possible. But it was, and we could have given an entire presentation tonight just on Palmerston. It's really a fascinating place. Fishing remains the only economic activity really for the people who are living there. They set their nets, gill nets inside the reef, and the whole family gets involved in the processing. Here they are filleting and weighing the fish and packaging it into these little saran wrap bundles that go into a freezer. The supply ship shows up 3 or 4 times a year and takes all the frozen fish back to Rarotonga, where it's sold in the markets. But it's what they do. They get up every morning and they go fishing. So we spent a week in this kind of wonderful, wacky place. And then it was time to go, and we headed off to Saguaro, which was a couple days to the north.
Yeah, we had a good passage to Saguaro, although we were going too fast. We wanted to really get there at daylight, not in the dark. So we slowed down intentionally. Saguaro was one of the 2 most remote places we went to on this voyage. The only way there is by private boat. And there's nothing when you get there except the abundance of birds and fish and sharks and healthy coral and gigantic land crabs on the atolls. It's a national park. The Cook Islands sends 2 rangers out there for the half a year when there are not cyclones. That's the half a year when boats are more likely to be moving around the South Pacific. And as a result of this no-take zone, there is much more life than you'd find in many other places. So we spent 5 days there. We spent 2 of them as the only boat in the anchorage, truly far from the maddening crowd. Now, leaving Saguaro, it was a bit blustery. The breeze was 25 knots or so, southeast by east. It had been blowing for a few days. So once we got out of the lee of the atoll, we began to roll deeply. We rigged a warp. This is only one of the few times on the trip. Streamed out about 100 feet of anchor rope with a length of chain on the end of it and a float. The goal is, and it works, it slows the boat down a little bit and it keeps the stern from swinging back and forth. But that swinging back and forth as you surf down the waves stresses the steering gear, and that's what we were trying to avoid. But it was rough that first night out, and we felt that just making some grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner was quite a triumph. A few days later, on the 7-day passage, we crossed the international date line, converted October 6th into October 7th at about 8:30 in the morning. You think of these lines, we'd cross the Tropic of Capricorn, we crossed the equator, we crossed the international date line. Later, we would cross the Tropic of, I said Capricorn, we crossed Cancer, and then equator, international date line, and later Tropic of Capricorn, little milestones. And then, voila, Kingdom of Tonga, 177 magical islands. As we approached, the boat got into the lee of Vava'u, still a good breeze. We shook out the reef from the Genoa. We shook out the reefs from the mainsail. We disconnected the self-steering, the monitor, and we started to hand steer. And suddenly it was like we were really sailing, small boat sailing again. We've been sailing for tens of thousands of miles, but ocean passage making is very different than sailing in amongst islands. So now we're each taking turns on the helm. We're feeling the boat, the rudder response, trimming the sails, and we ended up short tacking up through the harbor. You can see in the distance there that the entrance to the harbor is fairly narrow. Not a tricky pass or anything, but it just allowed us to maneuver the boat and anchor under sail, which we felt was a great fitting voyage, a great fitting end to that particular leg. Tonga is an undiscovered gem. It's really a wonderful place for people that like boats and simplicity. It suited the mate. And we were more relaxed in Tonga than we had been for a year. One day it came to me, my soul is rested. We were sleeping well in a place with real harbors, protected waters. You know, most of the South Pacific doesn't have harbors for beach. You're saying get out on these roadsteads. Real harbors, protected waters, scenic beauty, and friendly English-speaking people. They're very poor. The island poverty is sobering, but we spent 6 weeks in Tonga, various groups, and it was actually one of the high points of our trip.
The Tongan kids were charming. They were way more curious and eager to be photographed than the adults. And the boys, not surprisingly, were less shy than the girls. We noticed a lot of high school age kids wearing these flowers. It turns out when they complete their exams, they're given these flowers, so they wear them very proudly. It's a very religious culture, even a cross on their flag. But we did go to church several times, in part because we'd heard about the singing. We always felt a little bit underdressed. You know, the kids would have all their fancy clothes on and the men would have suits and still be in bare feet, but nevertheless, and the women all wearing white dresses and white hats. The sermons were all in the Tongan language, so we weren't catching a lot of that, but the singing was just spine tingling. It just made the hair stand up on the back of your neck. And it was incredible because they didn't have any sheet music. There was no instruments. It never appeared as if anyone was leading them, but they were just belting it out. And it went on for hours. It was really, really special. And then after that, you know, the joke was, there's this local language, and try as we might, we were only there for 6 weeks, but there was no way we were going to learn any of this language other than a few little phrases. Not sure what this sign was telling us to do in order 1, 2, 3, but
all the Polynesian languages are related. In other words, the Maoris in New Zealand, the Tongans, the Polynesians in French Poly, they can all understand each other to some extent. These English are all, but it was really hard for us, so we didn't wrap our heads around it.
You know, so we, you know, you'd see people and you'd smile and admire their tattoos. And, you know, it turns out that the reason that Tongans seem so relatively content is because, unlike lots of the other Pacific nations that we've been to, the Kingdom of Tonga has never been a colony of Europe. And so they've never relied on government subsidies. There's no anger and resentment that we saw in other places about sort of not getting enough from the mother country. Conveniently, all the land is owned by the king, and Tongans are fiercely independent. Their life priorities are family, church, feasts, lots of feasts, always with pigs involved. And there they were at the ends of the earth. And while we definitely noticed the poverty, you couldn't miss it. The people were always friendly and welcoming, always quick to smile, and their greeting was malo e lele. So we did get to learn how to say that. And, you know, they looked healthy and well-fed, except for their teeth, possibly from eating pineapples all the time. They do find it nearly impossible to say no. So no matter what you ask, they would say yes. And so if you asked if this is a vegetarian dish, they would say yes. And then if you said, but does it have meat in it? And they would say yes. So that was a little tricky. You know, we had a few little mix-ups there. And so often I would just say, well, maybe I'd just have a fresh coconut and I'll drink the coconut water. And interestingly, they were way aware of problems caused by plastic in the ocean, and they only use bamboo straws. So, and, you know, all along the way, we made some great friends, people who we'll be friends with for life. This is Maria. We took a little workshop and learned how to make necklaces out of the oyster shells. And, you know, little girl time was fabulous.
There's another one of our cruising couples. It was a young couple from the States, Ava and Pio. They've just had a baby. But
Yesterday,
Pio had bought a 50-year-old Ericsson 35 in Seattle. It was a pretty worn out boat. He yanked out the busted engine, put in some batteries and electric motor just for harbors, got his honey to agree that after some sailing, they could head out across the Pacific. And they were just a kind of adventurous spirit that we admired. We were lucky to have so many friends. We'd get together, and here's a table with Swedes, Danes, Americans, Germans, and Portuguese, and we're just living the cruising life. Here's again a table with some of our German and Scandinavian friends. Or this is a feast actually back in Huahine, but the great people. And we were, of course, lucky as Americans that all of these Northern European friends spoke perfect English. So now we're in Southern Tonga and we're focusing on the final leg of the trip. That is Tonga to New Zealand. This is crossing from the tropics into the temperate zones. You're always going to get a front. It's sort of like going from New England to the Caribbean in the fall of the year. Here it is, it's spring in the Southern Hemisphere. Summer cyclones, i.e. hurricanes, are coming, but the Southern Ocean winter isn't really over yet. Some veteran Kiwi sailors had warnings to share, but thankfully there was this amazing rest stop along the way where you could regather and wait for weather info.
So
Hundreds of miles from anywhere, North Minerva Reef. Check this out, aerial view. In the upper left corner, you see the little gap in the reef. That's where the boats can come in. This is the rim of an extinct volcano. This picture is at low tide. At high tide, no land shows. It just looks like ocean. And yet yachts can anchor in there, 35 feet deep, white sand bottom, good holding, protection from the sea all around. It's amazing.
yeah, so there were 17 boats. You can see them there on the horizon. This is taken from the reef at low tide, so you could walk around. And we were all waiting for a weather window so that we would have a decent passage from there the rest of the way to New Zealand. So we waited and we waited and we waited. I think we were there for about 10 or 12 days. We just talk about the weather every day. And then we, as boredom sort of set in, we started, somebody organized dinghy races in the afternoon. There was this great belly dancing just for the women on board one of the boats. I learned a few moves. And we were all doing these projects on each other's boats, you know, helping each other fix things. And after a while, we started singing the Eagles hit Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So, and I think too, by this point, because we knew New Zealand customs, when we arrived, we had been told that they would take away any of your fresh fruit and vegetables, a whole long list of stuff that they didn't want in the country because of invasive species. So we had all planned our provisions basically to run out by the time we got to New Zealand, but we stayed in Minerva Reef a little longer than we had meant to. And there was lots of bartering going on these last few days. It's like, do you have any dry milk powder? I'll give you a jar of peanut butter.
And one of the classic moments is the Scots woman, Anna, lovely. She was the one who taught belly dancing. She gets on the radio one morning and says, does anyone have any oats? You know, what's a Scot without a porridge? Well, we all knew that her husband was the best fisherman in the fleet. And then she says, we're willing to trade lobsters for oats. See,
Lobster
at
for
Minerva
oats?
Reef, lobsters are plentiful, but oats are in short supply. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Oh, and here we started calling ourselves the Minerva Reef Yacht Club. Very jovial group. We got to be good friends. They were from all over the world.
Here we are at our yacht club facilities, which
Yeah.
are always at low tide.
Yeah, and we were, you know, it's just hard to describe the gratitude we felt for the friendships that we formed along the way. But eventually we had to leave. It took us 6 days from North Minerva Reef to get to New Zealand. We ended up having a great passage, no scary weather. We made landfall at sunrise. Here we are entering the Bay of Islands, and we were just jubilant. 13 months and 15,000 miles, more or less,
yeah.
from the Piscataqua River to Opua, and, you know, hallelujah. It was an emotional overload, actually, in a lot of ways. And we were so happy. We were so proud, so awestruck by all that we'd seen. And I will say, you know, when I look at this picture, this is where we spent Christmas. We had no idea what was about to happen to the rest of the world.
So we had intended to just stay for cyclone season, then go back to sea to go to Fiji. But COVID came, interrupted the world. So we stayed in New Zealand for 19 months, a paradise for coastal cruising.
And just about every day, we talked about our profound gratitude for this strong boat, our good health, our supportive kids, and our deep connection and commitment to each other that lets us do this in the first place. And this trip so far, it's exceeded all of our wildest expectations. And the best part is that there's still more to come because we left Chanticleer in New Zealand.
So that means we can continue branding for the Gundalow Company as we go around the world. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. sharing this first leg from New Hampshire to New Zealand. And if anyone's wishes to hang around and ask questions, we'll try to answer them if somebody else moderates. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Molly and Jeff. That is a fantastic presentation. Gosh, such beautiful, beautiful sights, and all the people you got to meet there. It's just tremendous. So thanks for sharing that with us. I know there's a lot of people on this call that are just kind of, their mouths are open right now in awe of the things that you got to see and got to do. Andy, if you're there, he's been monitoring the chat room with the questions, so I think he's going to be the one to go ahead and ask it. Take it away, Andy.
Yeah, so definitely feel free to put more questions in the chat since there are so many people here. I think that'll be the best way to handle that. So I will kind of scroll through here and see if there's some good ones. But I saw one earlier from Mary Sue Beeler. Were you ever concerned about container ships or tankers during the night passages?
Oh, I'll answer that one. Yes. That was probably the only thing that did scare us, was that visual of finding a slightly submerged container. You know, we all know how many are out there. And so, yeah, I thought about it, but you know, you kind of put it aside and carry on, because if you're going 8 knots and it's pitch dark, there's not a lot you can do.
But the ship's underway. No, you see them. We have AIS. We talked about on the radio. But in the Pacific, again, we saw very few ships. We probably saw more ships between North Carolina and the Virgin Islands than we saw going across the Pacific. Where we were out there, you know, I've done this a long time, but when we were out there, there's just not much boat traffic. So no, collision at sea can ruin your whole day, but that was not one of the largest concerns by any means.
Andy, before you go to the next question, there was a Jeff and Molly, could you stop sharing your screen? People want to see.
Oh.
So
What do? Stop share, the red one.
Yeah, well, we'll try that. Thanks, Rich. We can sail, but we can't run computers.
you're doing fantastic.
And if
Right.
other people did want to turn on video now, that should be fine because it won't affect the presentation part. There's another one here from Anya George. How did you prevent spreading invasives when cleaning the bottom of the boat?
We didn't. I mean, if there was an invasive that we were spreading when we cleaned the bottom of the boat, it spread. It was
Well,
going to
but
get somewhere anyway. But
To your question, Anya, one of the requirements before you're allowed in to the Galapagos,
Right.
you have to send ahead a document, a certificate showing that you'd had your bottom cleaned in Panama. So we all did that.
Mhm.
And the idea was that hopefully in that passage between Panama and the Galapagos, we didn't pick up anything.
Right.
But they also inspected the bottom. I mean, when we got everywhere, one of the things you had to pass was the inspection where they would stick a camera down onto the boat and make sure you didn't have a bunch of hitchhikers. So
So
there
in-
was definite awareness about it.
And in New Zealand, we knew this was going to happen again. So
Yeah.
we hauled in Tonga and painted the bottom so that we were clean.
Pirate, Ron.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. gotcha. Great
There was inquiry about what sort of navigation techniques do you use for the passages when it's that far?
Oh, unfortunately, there's been a tremendous de-skilling of navigators. I was once a navigator. Now every 14-year-old kid in the world is a navigator. So we had a chart plotter, a GPS, some backups. I had my trusty sextant and the tables. We fooled around with it, but
Well, and we had paper charts too.
we had paper charts, and we're
Old school.
we're old school. But to be honest, it's electronic nav these days, and while we have all the backups and know how to use them, any 14-year-old kid with a phone can find his way anywhere. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't say
no,
that. But don't try this if you're 14 and just
Yeah,
have a fun.
But the one thing I would add to that is that we definitely had paper charts, but you saw Jeff in that one photo where he was up in the rigging looking. That was key because oftentimes you could see things by eye that you wouldn't have seen on the chart.
In
And
close quarters.
GPS, as great as it is in a lot of ways, is off by what, like 1,000 feet or something? It's
Well,
there are
it can be-
places
there are
where
wrecked
it's-
boats
yeah.
on the rocks.
So we
near
couldn't
these
always
passes,
trust
so,
the
yeah.
GPS. So as you get closer to land, you would, we always approach places in the daylight for one thing, and tried to have the sun angle in such a way that you could see things as you were approaching. So it's a combination for sure.
Lots of things.
Great. There's a semi-related here, but how do you sail at night? And they also said, do you have autopilot?
So we have yes, we have an autopilot.
We have a mechanical wind vane and we have an electronic autopilot. We use on the longest passage, we use the wind vane about 90% of the time, and the electronic one about 7 or 8% of the time, hand steered a little bit. So we have 3 kinds of steering: hand steering, electric autopilot steering, and mechanical wind vane steering. And in terms of sailing at night, there ain't no place anchor, guys, so you just go.
Well, and to answer, there's a couple parts to that question. The thing about the autopilot too is that the electronic autopilot really works best when the engine is running, and we didn't use the engine that much. And the wind vane works beautifully when you're under sail, and we're mostly under sail. So we had the wind vane set up to do the steering most of the time, 90% of the time. And then literally at night, we had a schedule. We had a watch system where one of us was always awake. We did 4 to 5 hours at a time. If I was awake for 4 or 5 hours, Jeff would be asleep. There was a whole routine of what we did at night, checking things constantly, blah, blah, blah.
Reading paperback books, eating gingerbread, come on.
But, and then during the day, we were pretty much awake. We would spell each other with naps. But at nighttime, we had a very, traditional watch, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. It was fun, actually.
There was, maybe this should have been mentioned at the very beginning, but someone asked, where are you right now?
Don't tell.
We're not in Ukraine.
No.
No, we're sitting in our condo on South Street
We're
in
in
Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
But the boat is in New Zealand.
Yeah.
It's a long story.
This is a good one. A few people were mentioning in the chat here. Did you see the Pacific Gyre or any of the other like plastic accumulations or trash accumulations in the ocean?
Well, we certainly have. We weren't as far north as that gyre that's about as big as Rhode Island, but we saw certainly discarded stuff. And on the windward shores of all these islands, there is plastic, and plastic, cast off sandals, water bottles, stuff, whatever.
Yeah, and I would add to that, part of what you're doing when you move onto a boat to have it become your whole world is lighten your footprint if you can. And so we made a point of not bringing a lot of packaging with us. We knew that as we got to these islands, there was no, Monday morning garbage pickup where the garbage would disappear. So you didn't want to bring garbage ashore because they would just throw it in the ocean. So we did everything we could to, think about the packaging and to minimize it as much as we could. But garbage is definitely a problem. I'd say just in our experience, it's a much bigger problem on the islands that we witnessed than even out in the open ocean. Although we did see some bits here and there, but you definitely, they hide. They put it all in one place around the corner, but it's there and it's definitely a problem.
Yeah. Another downside here, did you notice any effects of climate change in the places you have been
through? We could see around the curve, like the San Blas Islands, for instance, inches between the water and these houses. So they're going to be some of the first ones to be submerged. So, and they're aware of it. They're definitely talking about it. So maybe not evidence, but awareness for sure.
And with also with that Minerva place you were in, is that because it's kind of intertidal where it is already? So any change in sea level seems like that would disappear pretty quick too.
Well, that won't really affect its reality.
There aren't any trees or there's no people living in it, but it will,
every high tide it's already underwater.
So, right.
Yeah. But
and it's only been in the last maybe 20 years that boats like us would even consider stopping there. For millennia, people would avoid it. They'd give it a wide berth because you can't see it until you're right on top of it. So with electronic navigation, now people know they can tuck in there and wait for the weather. But it used to be a place where you would make sure you were 100 miles away from it because there half of the time it just doesn't show. So.
All right. Other questions?
Someone asked what sort of breakdowns you encountered while doing your transits?
Mental breakdowns? Equipment breakdown?
I can answer that. We did not have any serious breakdowns. Some of you know that our boat went through 2 hurricanes in the Caribbean about a year and a half before we left. So it forced us to do a thorough refit. We had, of course, all the niggling little things that are just nonstop, okay? You've got to change filters and change belts and change oil and pay attention to the rig and don't give chafe a chance and all the rest. So it's nonstop, that stuff just breaks. We were lucky that nothing really important broke. So yeah, we changed the carburetor and the outboard and blah, blah, blah. So there's constant sort of mechanical tweaking, but we did not have any big catastrophic system failure.
We had one brief moment that gave us pause for thought. And it was there's this little knob on the oven that regulates the temperature. And, I used to make, Jeff was losing weight, he was eating, but he was losing weight. So I kept making, bread and gingerbread and cookies, and I'm trying to, keep him plump for Jeff. But so I'm thinking, oh my God, if the engine or if the oven stops working, there's going to be no more gingerbread, no more anything that we can bake. So we sort of scratched our head and we thought, we didn't really want to dive in and take the whole thing apart in case we really broke it. So in the end, what we did, we had this aerosol can of this product.
PD blaster,
Yeah.
corrosion buster.
And it says all over it, toxic and flammable, and don't use it near any open flame. And we're there spraying it onto the oven, hoping that the whole boat wasn't going to blow up. And lo and behold, it fixed the oven. And so we went back to baking. But there
And
really weren't
Molly
any.
said, what would Joshua Slocum have done about this? But of course, he didn't have
He didn't
it.
have enough. in it,
Gas
so,
up.
yeah. And
What else, Andy?
Okay.
Someone asked about a water maker. I know you had talked about that before leaving too.
Yeah. So that was my favorite title. Jeff was the captain, and you only need one captain on the boat. But I did a number of things. My favorite title was by far being the water maker. And we had this big machine, desalinate, how do you say it?
Reverse
osmosis desalination. Take water out of the ocean, put it through this very elaborate machine that made a lot of noise and had all these valves and bells and made a lot of noise. And voila, it made 8 gallons an hour of fresh water. It was just the nuts. So we had 2 big tanks on board. We could carry about 130 gallons of fresh water. And so every few days I would make water just to make sure the tanks were always full. So it was a great thing to have along. It's not something that everybody we met had. It's certainly not something that people ever used to have. But when you show up at an island where there are just dug wells and there's people living there without much water, the last thing you want to be is that white person showing up with your jerry jug saying, so where's the fresh water? Can we fill up our jug? So we felt, self-reliant that we could make our own water, which was important.
Cool. The other big question a few people are asking is where next?
You tell
we
us.
might go downtown tomorrow morning and have coffee.
We're not making
the-
plans.
The state of the world right now, who knows? But we hope to spend summer in New England, the charming season here. And then if we can, return to New Zealand in what's our fall, would be their spring, and fit out the boat for a Southern Hemisphere cruise around New Zealand. And then if things are still good, leave in May, which is the time to go to the tropics, and head to Fiji and hopefully carry on. But who knows?
A lot of ifs.
Yeah.
Yep. Great. I think that was, there's one last one from Kent Allen here. What make was your engine on board? Although it sounded like you didn't use it too much.
Oh, well, no, we use it. It's a Westerbeek. It's a 48 horsepower, 4-cylinder Westerbeek diesel. For these sort of distances, you can't really make it. If we carry 10 jugs of fuel plus what's in our tank, we could almost make it from Newport to Bermuda motoring, okay? But across the Pacific, you just don't have any range, and we didn't carry 10 extra jugs of fuel. We didn't want to use that space. So the diesel engine was fine, didn't break down, and we used it going in and out of harbors, really occasionally when it was really calm, but not so much.
Great. I think that was all the ones I saw in the chat, unless there was, now there's more. What and how many kinds of sails did you have?
We've got new sails. We bought new sails for the trip. We should have done it long ago. Our old ones were pretty shapeless, but we had the 3 working sails, mainsail, staysail, and Genoa, all brand new. We carried a spare Genoa, a slightly larger, slightly lighter cloth, and we carried that Drifter, the multicolored light air sail that you saw in one picture. We hardly ever used it, tripped over it too much. So that was it. And we were fine.
Someone said, was it easier to go the route you did rather than the reverse? So you had gone west.
Yeah. The route we went is called the Coconut Milk Run. Okay. We have been together in this boat, and I have been in many other boats, slammed in the North Atlantic and part of the Caribbean. You know, trying to go to windward is tough. By the time we got to the West Indies on this trip, it was all downwind to New Zealand. It was very, very easy. And so we were in what's called the Coconut Milk Run, the tropical weather passage. Okay. So this was relatively easy. It's hard to convince people because the distances of that, but the challenges in the North Atlantic and the Caribbean proper, moving back and forth, going to Newfoundland or whatever, can be much greater.
And that's why people keep sailing to the west.
Right.
You just keep going to the west, because if you turn around and try to come back, you'd be smack right into the wind. Not a nice trip. We're not going to do that trip.
So maybe the boat will continue heading west from New Zealand eventually to get back.
We hope so. We don't know. You know, stay tuned.
Stay tuned, right? We'll let you know.
And for anyone else that wasn't following along before, they did have a live map where you can see the location and some notes that I think mostly Molly had written. So we'll stay posted on that. It looks like the Grassos had a question here. They hit the button here.
I have one question, Professor Bolster, Dr. Bolster, dissertation director Bolster. You mentioned that chafe was in fact the enemy.
Mhm.
Can you now, at this point, and this is a question to both of you, promise that in the next slideshow, we don't ever have to see Jeff in a pair of really tight black spandex underwear?
Hey, look, man, I said that we were often naked. She made me get dressed to go chase away those boobies.
I wasn't going to take pictures of him naked, so that was the next best thing. I hear you though.
Yeah, okay. All right, Glenn, we got
Fair
it.
enough, Glenn.
Yeah, don't give Chafe a chance, right?
Great. Well, I think that's probably about it for the questions here. And I'll just plug, so this is the first of our series here, World Ocean Experiences. And so next week, same time, same place, we will have Blue Latitudes, which a few of you may have been on a presentation with them before, but talking about rigs to reefs and some of the continued work they've done with that, where they turn oil rigs into wonderful fish habitats and other aquatic things. So I'll be next Thursday at 7 o'clock as well. And then the following Friday, we will have Brian Scarry, who is a National Geographic photographer, talking about, it's titled Luminous Seas. So he'll be talking about all the pictures of wonderful places that he's taken his award-winning photos from as well. So both of those will be upcoming, but you can either go to gundalow.org or you'll probably get a follow-up email right after this one. But we will send out, if you have anyone you wanted to share this video with, we'll try to get the recording on YouTube within a couple days here and share that. So thanks everyone for coming along. And this is a good opportunity. If you do want to unmute yourself, we can kind of give them a round of applause so they can see everyone and hear us all again. So.
Hey.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly and Jeff. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see
We're gonna leave.
everyone from far away.